Hi everybody, Dave Rauch here, CEO of ProTech Building Services. And again, we're with Scott Stewart, the ex-manager of Champlain Towers South. And today is the second video in our series, and we're going to be discussing the aftermath of the collapse of Champlain Towers South. Let's switch gears a little bit, Scott, and talk about the reserve study.
Yes.
I know that there was a reserve study that was commissioned, I think it was about 2018, 3 years prior to the collapse.
Actually, it was we actually did it under my tenure.
Okay.
So that would have been more like the latter of 19 or early 20.
Okay, and then I had actually contacted them and asked them, what they knew about the maintenance of the building, if anything was odd or off. And I asked them if they had even talked to the building engineers, and they said, well, they didn't. Maybe it was because they didn't speak English. I'm not sure.
That was part of it, yes.
Yeah. So what is your experience with the reserve company and them putting together the reserve study?
I thought they did actually a very good job, because prior to that, there was really no reserve study. They were very thorough and everything. I actually walked the building with them to the different maintenance rooms and all that, and then turned them on their own to say, tell me what I want your eyes on it. I don't want me to distract you.
Or bias.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
So they also took into account the fact that we were also under engineer for a lot of the repairs. So there were some things that would normally go on a reserve schedule that probably weren't on that one.
Gotcha.
Only because they knew it was already being addressed.
And I just want to clarify for our viewers that Florida at the time did not have a reserve study requirement.
Correct.
But in last year, Florida legislature did pass a new law because of the collapse, actually, precipitated by the collapse, that does now require Florida to have reserve studies.
Yes,
so,
and reserves.
So it was actually, at your urging, something they didn't have to do, but something they did do to get the reserve study going. And I believe I recall, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the reserve, they did accumulate 400,000 in reserves by the time of the collapse, or
total we had $1.6 million in reserves.
Oh, okay. More than I had read.
Yes. But for years, the only thing that they would reserve for was the insurance policy. They really had no schedule before that.
Gotcha. Well, better late than never, I guess.
It was a starting point.
Yeah, but I commend you for getting that going.
I had a good board of directors, and they listened to guidance.
Yeah, no, that was.
That's what a lot of people forget. In the state of Florida, the managers are licensed. We have to go through so much education. I'm fortunate I actually have taken advanced courses for more understanding.
Yes.
And I have a passion.
Well, and I have a passion in educating the industry in the fact that a reserve study is not a maintenance plan.
No.
It's not a maintenance schedule. It's not maintenance protocols. It really has very little to do with maintenance. It's basically a budget where you're reserving monies to replace components that fail.
Yes.
And in my opinion, it's great to have. You need to have a reserve study, but more importantly, you need the maintenance plan, the list of inspections, and the maintenance program doing the maintenance.
Yes.
So you don't have to replace things.
Well,
or at the very worst, you replace them as far away as possibly. As we were just discussing, a building collapse is very unusual. It's very unusual that it happens. And we're all intimately familiar with what happened at 9/11 when two buildings, the World Trade Center, collapsed. Now that was caused by external forces. We learned a lot from that collapse.
Yes,
we learned that jet fuel will burn steel. We learned a lot of other things too, and it changed the course of history.
Changed fire codes.
Changed everything. So There's a lot to be learned similarly from this collapse of this building, and I believe it's incumbent upon us and the industry as a whole um, to take these lessons learned and see if we can improve the industry.
Definitely.
And I do know that CAI National put together 3 task forces 2 years ago. I was part of 2 of those, and to do just that, it came up with a public safety policy report. That's this one right here. This report, which these recommendations were given to legislatures throughout the country to make changes to improve building safety, public safety in these buildings. So, what, in your perspective, are the most important lessons learned from this tragedy?
Um, oh wow. That people have a disregard of safety
Hmm.
until it's too late. Um, there needs to be a maintenance plan put in place, and people need to understand what they're looking at and for.
Hmm. And I know in California we have earthquakes
Mm-hmm.
and we have earthquake drills and we have regular fire safety drills because, in my opinion, fire is extremely scary.
Yes,
I never want to get a call that one of the high rises we maintain is on fire. That's terrifying.
the worst fear ever in a
And
high
so,
rise.
and that's the frustration is there's not enough practice drills on earthquake fire safety, and be the same here. I would imagine in Florida.
Oh yeah, I mean, you get even on a regular call when the all alerts going on, people will call down to the front desk, is this real? Instead of
Mhm.
actually evacuating the building.
Yeah,
So, and quite honestly, fire drills, they don't happen.
yeah.
The people are too inconvenienced by them.
It's unfortunate but true. So what else? What can we do to get HOA boards, at least, or managers, to take these safety issues more seriously and to take maintenance more seriously?
They need to understand that it's going to cost them more money down the road.
Hmm.
It's easier and cheaper just to take care of the problem now and to fix it than defer it until later. Not only from a cost perspective, but from a safety perspective. What happens if that water pump goes out? What's the water pump do? It supplies water throughout the whole building. So trying to replace it on an emergency basis is going to be very expensive. Unless you want to live without water up to your unit for 5, 10 days with a
Yeah,
custom parts built.
that's actually one piece of the maintenance puzzle
Mm-hmm.
on high rises, which is difficult for a lot of boards to understand that.
Yes.
They do understand you have to exercise the natural gas or gas shutoff valves to a building,
Most don't.
but a lot don't. But into each unit, the way high rises are built, oftentimes there's a water shutoff to each unit.
Mm-hmm.
And if those water shutoff valves aren't exercised on a regular basis and maintained, which means lubricated,
Yep.
exercised and lubricated, then when you go to shut up, when there's a flood in the unit and you need it to shut it off the most,
Yep.
it breaks
Yes.
and you can't shut off the water, and you're looking at millions
Yes.
versus thousands. And actually, you were working with your guys on that particular issue too.
Yes. We were actually
So,
replacing a lot of valves and pressure regulators and making sure they understood how to exercise valves and repacking and
mhm,
yes, a lot of
yeah,
work.
there's a tremendous amount of maintenance that goes into buildings.
Yes.
People don't realize that. I think it may be because when they buy a car, you know, uh, they think that the only maintenance you have to do is change the oil and lubricate,
Yes.
change the tires every now and then. But a building is not a car. Buildings are, as you said, live. They're alive.
They're
I mean,
live and breathing with a heartbeat.
and every one of them's different.
Yes.
And so it's hard to explain to a board of directors the importance of maintenance.
Well, and like you had said with a car, at least you have nowadays you have a lot of electronic warnings,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of it's taken care of when you take it in for your oil change. What do you think it costs you $139 for an oil change? Because
Yeah.
they're doing all the maintenance for you.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there that you don't see. Same thing in the building.
Yep.
People will cut back on maintenance because they don't see it, they don't think it's going on.
Yeah.
What they should be doing is actually spending more and actually following a schedule and a plan.
Right. And that's, we're going to get to that. I want to talk about what a developer should provide at the
Mhm.
inception of a building. But before we do that, let's take a few minutes and talk about first the Florida task force that was put together
Mhm.
to provide recommendations to the Florida legislature on what needed to change. And
Mhm.
then let's talk about the Florida law. And then we'll talk also about the public policy safety report from the three task forces that CAI National had. So there was the Florida statewide task force, and then there was the national task force.
Yes.
So let's hit upon the
This
Florida task force first. I do have a copy of it here. Um,
this is where I'm gonna get in trouble. You know that, right?
That's okay. You speak your mind. It's a large document, a large report.
Yes.
And I have spoken to Bill Sklar, who was appointed the chair of this, and they put a lot of work into this. My frustration was they said it right here. The task force believes that through maintenance protocols,
Mhm.
which is maintenance inspections and maintenance manuals, transparency of governance and communication, regular inspections, which is a maintenance plan, of a meaningful content and a funding plan, reserve study, the life safety of the residents of Florida condominiums and cooperatives will be enhanced and protected.
Yes.
So that's what they recommended. And that's not what they got in the Florida law.
It is not. Well, I do understand that the task force put a lot of time and effort into it. I do believe they missed things. But majority of the people on this task force were attorneys.
Mhm.
So they weren't looking at it from a property perspective or from an engineer and architect's perspective.
Mhm.
I would have liked to have seen more cooperation between all the people to actually go through and put it together.
Yeah, I wasn't witness to the process. I didn't even know the task force was going on,
Well,
being in California.
I was actually intimately involved with Champlain Towers, and this is all about basically because of that.
Ah, and they talked to you, or?
No, never contacted. I didn't even know what was going on until after one of the attorneys that I happened to befriend said, "Oh yeah, I'm on this committee."
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I have to give it to Bill Sklar, very intelligent and
Yes,
very
extremely.
successful lawyer. And I asked him, what maintenance were they doing? What were the maintenance procedures? What were the inspections that they were doing? He said, we don't know.
Yeah.
And but I will give it to him. He did say, I want to quote this right here. This is from Bill Sklar. And this kind of gives really the flavor of where they were coming from. I'll give you the 1 minute conclusion, they
Mm-hmm.
said. Unlike commercial buildings, unlike office buildings, unlike city and county buildings, unlike residential buildings, condo associations have no standardized baseline maintenance protocol, Sklar told me. And that's what he told to this
Agree.
this New York Times piece here. And that's true. It's the reason why, you know, condominiums are so different than other buildings. Because in other buildings, you have either a building owner,
Mm-hmm.
Building Owners Managers Association, BOMA, as
Yes.
representative of those building owners, or you have a government entity or a medical center, you have a medical entity, but there's always somebody in charge of making sure that building's running efficiently and being well maintained.
Yes.
All parts of that building.
Well, and there's more involved to it. When a individual or a corporation actually owns a building like that, they do get incentives.
Mhm.
Not only from energy companies, tax breaks, all those things. In a condominium association, the association owns the building. So if they make improvements, there are no tax breaks, there are no rebates because it's a not-for-profit corporation.
Is that to say then, if there is a $10,000 per unit special assessment, that the homeowner can't write off that $10,000?
That's my understanding.
Wow.
Or the interest if the building takes out a loan.
Can't write off the interest.
No,
Hmm.
the association doesn't need it because it's a not-for-profit. They're not taxed.
Mm-hmm.
What should be happening is a proportional share of that deduction should be going back to the unit owners.
Mm-hmm.
So if you paid $1,000 in interest, you should be getting notice that you paid this much in interest.
That's interesting.
If a FPNL or Florida Power and Light has a rebate program,
Mm-hmm.
should be able to give that back to all the residents. After all, they're the ones that paid for it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But that starts at the federal level and all the way down.
Yep. So that issue, as Bill Sklar had identified, that's what makes residential condos, especially high rises and condominiums, so unique.
Yes.
It makes it so difficult because not one person is in charge. The HOA, the board of directors, is in charge, and it's you're taxing yourself.
Yes.
But more importantly, they don't have the guidance, the information that they need to properly maintain that high rise.
Yes.
Um,
And the fact that the average board of directors turns over every year, at least in a
that
city
too.
owned ownership,
Mhm.
you're going to retain that asset for a while.
Yep.
A city, the typical mayor's 4 years,
Mhm.
at least 2 years,
Mhm.
but typically four.
And anything else, Scott, on the task force or the new Florida law?
I wish it would have just gone further.
Yeah. Yeah, the new Florida law, just for our viewers, because they're not all from Florida,
Mm-hmm.
most are from California. The new Florida law mandates that condominiums now have reserve studies,
Mm-hmm.
and it mandates a 30-year, not 40-year, but a 30-year certification from a structural engineer.
Yep.
That they're at 30 years of age, it's inspected structurally, which, in my opinion, it sounds like you agree, is woefully short of what's needed here, especially in Florida. Um, and I can talk about the national report here that CAI came up with, the Condominium Safety Public Policy Report. It went much further.
Yes.
It recommended to all states that developers should provide at the inception of the new community a set of blueprints, as built,
As minimum.
and other documents, so that the HOA has ownership of not just the building, but the blueprint, the documents. And that's just common sense. And then the other thing that CAI National recommended here, nationally, was that the developer provide the new community with a reserve study.
Mm-hmm.
And currently, only, I think, 8 states mandate reserve studies, maybe 9. They also mandate that they have, Bill Sklar calls them maintenance protocols, but it's basically a maintenance manual,
Yes.
which lists every common area component with a digital photograph of them and how to maintain them.
Yes.
So it's like the maintenance manual in the glove box of your car. It tells the board of directors, who are lay people, what needs to be maintained, when, and how.
Exactly.
And so so this report actually went much further and more specific than the Florida task force did.
Yes.
Um,
But a community association institute, actually, that's what its primary function is.
mhm,
Is to help educate.
right.
It's an association of managers and boards and their
Attorneys,
attorneys, and
vendors. Yep.
so it's a place for them to get together and discuss these things,
Hmm.
and come up with these ideas.
Yep. And actually, the three task forces comprised about 600 people.
Yes.
I know the reserve study task force had 200 or 300 people on it. I was on it and saw all the email addresses. And then the building maintenance and structural inspection task force was much smaller. It was 25 people, I
Yes.
think. I'm not really sure.
Well, even let's go back to this manual for a moment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
It was actually a very interesting conversation that we had last night with a gentleman that's from the Coast Guard.
Ah,
And you think about a ship. A high rise is a ship on end.
mhm.
But if you walk onto any ship that has people in it, you're going to see very detailed operations manual for everything on that ship.
Mhm.
And you're going to see those records and how they're maintained and that somebody actually looked at it.
And in the case of the Coast Guard, there's consequences if you
Yes.
don't maintain the records.
But here, I mean, you think about it, even with all this that's going on,
Mhm.
the agencies in charge of making sure this stuff is happening have no teeth. There's nothing that they can do
Yeah.
if you don't do it except for fine you.
Yeah.
So you're going to fine me because I can't afford to do things. You need to hold people accountable.
Right.
Not, that's the biggest thing.
Yeah.
But there is no
No,
accountability.
and the Florida Task Force, it said it had maintenance protocols, but there needs to be accountability. They
Yeah.
have to come in with a law that says you're gonna have a maintenance manual. And in California, some governing documents do say in the governing documents you have a maintenance manual. You must implement it, which means you do the inspections and
Mhm.
any resulting maintenance that you uncover. But it's not countrywide. It's not
Which is-
national,
which is sad.
yeah. And the other issue is, as you've brought up, is you lose all that history.
Yes.
If you had a maintenance manual at the beginning of the community and the blueprints and the as-built and the engineering documents,
That's property of the association.
that's the property association, and now we can digitize all this
Yes.
stuff. So if you had all that and you're doing the inspections, the maintenance inspections that are done every year are memorialized.
Yes.
You save them.
Yes.
So that when there's some problem down the road, you come back and you look at what may have caused this issue.
Yes. You
So-
can see if a typical motor burns out every 3 years, you could say, hey, there's something going on here.
Yes.
After the second or third replacement.
Yeah. And that's the thing is it's really the manager or the building contractor, the building engineering company
Yes.
that would go through those records. The
Yes.
board of directors wouldn't
And
do
they
that.
would notice
But
these
there's
patterns.
tremendous amount of history
Yes.
in a building.
Oh, yes.
And you've got to make it available for research.
Yes.
So anyhow, what are your thoughts on Bill Sklar's and the National Task Force's recommendations on providing a reserve study and a maintenance manual and a maintenance program to new communities? Is there anything else that you think we should ask developers to provide at their inception of their new communities?
No, I think that's a fantastic start.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it should be that way. If you go and buy a car, like you had said, you get a maintenance manual.
Mm-hmm.
If you buy an appliance, you get a maintenance manual. A building, you don't get that. Well,
Crazy, isn't it?
yeah, and you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars.
Or $1 billion.
Yeah.
Look at this.
Yeah,
This
final
insurance
settlement,
payment is $1
yeah.
billion,
Yes.
and that's for a 40-year-old building.
Yes.
I know that I believe it's called the Metropolitan in San Francisco.
Mhm.
There's a building in San Francisco. I don't
The
know
one that's sinking?
the one that's tilting.
Yes.
I can't even imagine what the value of that building is.
Yeah.
But these buildings are extremely valuable.
Yes.
So anyhow, it's just unimaginable that we can't ask developers to just provide simple documents upon turnover.
It shouldn't be about asking. It should be about us demanding.
I do want to talk a little bit about education.
Oh, yes.
Because educating board members is obviously an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned earlier, board members change every year,
Mm-hmm.
which is really makes it difficult.
Difficult.
But there's no educational requirements for board members, which,
In Florida, there is.
oh, there is.
Um, doesn't happen, and there's no monitoring. In the state of Florida, within 90 days or 6 months prior to becoming on the board, you actually have to attend a class.
Hmm.
It covers the basics.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have to provide a certification that you've read and understand Florida statute and the association government docs,
Mm-hmm.
and that you're going to abide by them.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no tracking of it.
Yeah.
There's, other than the fact that you're not supposed to be on the board anymore, there's no enforcement of it.
Hmm. Well, that's sad
And a
for
property
Florida, and it's
manager,
not a good sign for the rest of the
yeah, and
country
you think
either.
about it, what's a property manager going to do?
Yeah,
They don't want to get fired.
right. It's hard to tell your boss to go get educated.
Yeah, otherwise you're not on the board anymore.
But I guess that is the manager's job, though, to try
Yes.
to coax and cajole and convince a board of directors that there's a lot to
Yes.
maintaining and managing these buildings, and
But
that,
then again, they're volunteers.
yeah, and then the turnover. So it's a very, very difficult subject, but it needs to be figured out.
Yes.
I do know that, at least in California, maybe you can comment on Florida. California, I feel the community association managers get a tremendous amount of education. It's a little bit biased because it's usually the attorneys teaching most of the classes.
Here's the
And,
vendors.
and and vendors teach the classes. I've taught a lot of classes.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is not a bad thing.
But I think the community managers get good education.
Yes. In Florida, we actually have licensing requirements that require so much education per year.
Mhm.
They just, unfortunately, they just lowered that requirement.
Mhm.
Same thing for getting your license. You used to have to take more credit hours, and they lowered that. So we're going the opposite direction.
Yeah, and California didn't want licensing, and that's a whole nother story. But um, so really, the issue, in my opinion, is the education of board members.
Yes.
And I think that CAI is starting to tackle this issue. Well, they've got a great track record of educating board members.
Yes, and they have
CAI,
on their
but you,
website, they have some great information.
yeah, the great information. I would prefer to see more videos. People like videos. They're easy to watch and
Yes.
easy to learn from. And I think that might be the way to go, is more videos and less classroom. Any other thoughts, Scott, on education, board members, managers?
I just wish there was more of it, especially in the maintenance fields. A lot of people don't understand it. And the education that's out there right now is very minimal,
Mhm.
or like I said, it's vendor specific. And though, at least here in Florida, they try not to, but they're to sell their company.
Yeah, and fortunately, I was involved just recently in putting together with an excellent committee of individuals from that are active in CAI, best practices of maintenance.
Yes,
And I think that that's going to be a good start,
definitely.
but education is an ongoing process, and we need to figure that out too. I agree with you. Maintenance is something that people just don't understand it. One final subject I want to touch on before we end, and that is the tearing down of high rises and condo high rises here in Florida.
Yes.
And what I've read is that so far 400 high rises have been torn down, purchased by developers, and torn down, and new ones built up, and a lot in the process too.
Yes.
I think that is a good process, because those buildings at 40, 50, 60 years of age really do reach the end of their useful life. It's kind of hard to rehab a high rise. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm surprised it's only 400 because I remember reading the article you're talking about, and that's over a 10-year period. That's not that many.
Yeah.
There needs to be a lot more.
Hmm.
Only because a lot of these buildings are poorly maintained. The they were rushed in being built. Um, I like to point out a lot of times about New York. New York was built with steel.
Hmm.
We're built with concrete. Concrete's porous.
Hmm.
Water gets into the rebar.
Yep.
The life expectancy is a lot different. Because I used to hear all the time, well, in New York, the building's 150 years old. Yes, it is, and it's built totally different.
Steel.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And iron. Yeah.
yeah. Um,
I actually have an interesting point. I don't know if you know this, but if you were to take a concrete column
mhm.
and immerse it in water, the water will actually percolate up,
It's a
by
wick.
osmosis. It wicks up 132 feet.
Oh, I didn't know it went that far.
Yes.
I know it wicks though.
That's why you never want to subject the foundation of your house to water.
Okay.
You want to have that positive slope away from the foundation of the house so water never gets near your foundation because the foundation, the concrete, will suck that water up.
Well, that scares me even more here in Florida then
Sorry to
because
say that.
everything's built on concrete piles.
Hmm.
To reinforce into
Yeah, they can
lime
be
rock.
waterproofed.
Yeah,
They can be
they're
waterproof.
supposed to be.
Yeah, they're supposed to be
Even the ones
properly
that
waterproof.
Champlain were supposed to be.
Yeah.
Um,
But the waterproofing breaks down with time too and has to
exactly.
be replaced,
And
just like the
in a
flashing on windows.
in a pylon, there you can't do that. Think about it.
Yeah.
Now without destabilizing the building. But yeah, I mean these buildings that were built back in those days, in the 70s and 80s, it was the Wild West in Florida. You gave the inspectors a few $1,000s and they didn't even bother to come out. They just signed off on it.
Hmm. Yep.
A lot of them need to be torn down because again, people bought here as their second home,
Hmm.
as their retirement home. Again, they didn't bother to maintain it because it's my second home.
Yeah.
Not going to put that kind of money into it.
It's an adventure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So being replaced with new modern structures, I think it's great.
I think so too.
But like we said, they need to be done correctly.
Well, my whole point is with maintenance, and that's my passion is maintenance.
Mhm.
If, for instance, if you look at Havana, Cuba,
Yes.
I've seen pictures there. I've never been
I've
there.
actually been.
So you've seen all those old cars
Yes.
and all those beautiful old buildings.
Yes.
And if you look at cities and towns in Europe,
Yes.
those cities and towns and buildings have been maintained meticulously for hundreds of years, some of them.
Yes.
And so you can take a high rise here in Southern Florida and you can through maintenance make it last twice as long as you think it could.
Easily.
But it takes money.
Yes.
You have to recaulk, you have to reinstall water repellent, you have to do all kinds of things. It
Yes.
takes some expense and energy, but you can make a building last not 40 years, but 80 years.
Easily.
And so that's to me, I think, where we should head. And even South Beach in Florida.
Yes.
Some of the Art Deco buildings have been meticulously maintained
Yes,
because
they
they have value,
Yes.
right? Well, the same can be done with everybody's condo
Every building
with maintenance.
with maintenance.
Maintenance is the key, in my opinion.
And knowing what you're supposed to maintain.
So, anyhow, I just want to end here by recapping real quick the importance of what we're doing, and that is trying to honor those who perished by trying to improve our industry and by learning these lessons. But it's not just enough to talk about it for us to talk about. We have to go out and change the laws.
Mm-hmm.
We have to change best practices. There's so much that has to be done. But, if we don't do it, there's going to be more tragedies.
Yes.
I guarantee you. And not just in Florida, all over the country, there's going to be tragedies if we don't start learning these lessons. And then so it's with much honor and appreciation for those people that perished that I thank you for doing this here today.
Oh,
and
thank
for
you.
taking the time to meet with us.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me be heard and honoring some of my dear friends that passed.
Well, thank you, Scott. And thank you, everybody. Please stay safe.